Hello, BookTube. Let us return to the Bankrupt Bookseller with a section called Anthology Buyers. For a desultory reader, the anthology is the gateway to literary ecstasy. I like the very word. Its etymology delighted me when I turned it up in one of the dictionaries. An anthology is a collection of choice poems, especially epigrams. The origin of the word is the Greek anthologia, from anthos, a flower, and logia, a collection. Isn't that really pretty? A collection of flowers. I am fond of anthologies and rarely resist buying them. I have a lot I am afraid I will never sell. Anthologies do date as the ladies' specialist next door said surprisingly once about some outrageous hatch which compelled a comment, even from me. For all that, the first anthology I ever grew fond of is one which now I imagine is out of date. I have a copy, but care not either if I sell it. I read it through from the four bold letters printed on the cover to the notes at the end. It is Lyra Heroica, a book of verse for boys, and the lines on the cover are the noble lines quoted by Sir Walter Scott in Old Mortality. Sound, sound, the clarion fill and fife, to all the sensual world proclaim, one crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name. The preface, written by William Ernest Henley, who made the collection, is in keeping with the book, and this passage of prose, I think, matches anything really, fine though the contents are, that the book contains. Henley writes, quote, my purpose has been to choose and sheave a certain amount of those achievements in verse, which, as expressing the simpler sentiments and the more elemental emotions, might fitly be addressed to such boys and men, for that matter, as are privileged to use our noble English tongue. To set forth as only art can the beauty and the joy of living, the beauty and the blessedness of death, the glory of battle and adventure, the nobility of devotion to a cause, an ideal, a passion even, the dignity of resistance, the sacred quality of patriotism. That is my ambition here. I wonder if any better preface has ever been penned to any book. I know of none, certainly. The contents range the evergreen and the lovely fields of English poetry from Shakespeare to Kipling. Some of the pieces I have in no other book on my shelf, thus from the Marquis of Montrose, was a deciding factor in the decision that made me become a bookseller. Little could James Graham have thought of that consequences. Yes, please God, I am not the last any more than I was the first who was thrilled to act by the challenge of these four ringing lines. He either fears his fate too much, or his deserts are small. Who dares not put it to the touch to gain or lose it all? I have always liked the book for that passage. It proves that poets are the real legislators of the world, for James Graham made my fate as surely as he sang his own in that very verse. The book is full of good things, but I cannot make an anthology of this piece of writing by transcribing the whole book verse for verse. For the love of it, I read again, and having reread writ note 11, Henley comments on the lines of Beaumont in Westminster Abbey. Quote, here is an acre sown indeed with the richest royalest seed that the earth did e'er suck in. And his comment includes that wonderful passage from Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World, a book I have never seen but would buy for these lines alone, even if it lay a lifetime on my shelves. And he quotes, O eloquent, just, and mighty death, whom none could advise thou hast persuaded, that none had dared thou hast done, and whom all the worlds hath flattered, thou only hast cast out of the world and despised. Thou hast drawn together all the far-stretched greatness, all the pride, cruelty, and ambition of man, and covered it all over with these two narrow words: Heck Jusset. Jasset. Heck Jasset. To me, that is just wonderful. My stock of anthologies does not stop at Lyra Heroica, though there is none I like better. I have songs and ballads of Greater Britain compiled by E.A. Helps, formerly one of H.M. Inspectors of Schools. This is a good collection and an eye-opener and a heart-opener, too, to those who think English poetry was all written in England. To me, it is curious how prolific the Australians have been. The poetry in this collection is little known. Hardly a name is even familiar by much of it deserves to be. This to a sentimental bookseller is delicately lovely, and he quotes, "The song that once I dreamed about, the tender touching thing, the radiant as the rose without, the love of wind and wing, the perfect verses to the tune of wooded music set, as beautiful as afternoon, remain unwritten yet." That is by Henry Kendall. The standard anthologies of poetry and my best sellers in books of pride are two Oxford books: the Oxford Book of English Verse and the Oxford Book of Victorian Verse. These are always in demand, and for the lover of poetry, they are indispensable. It may be morbid, but my favorite poem it is in both is Non Nobis. The Victorian verse book gives the author as Henry Cust, but in the earlier book it is classified as anonymous. And he quotes 3 lines. "To us thou givest the scorn, the scourge, the scar, the ache of life, the loneliness of death, the insufferable sufficiency of breath." That last line, can anyone read it without feeling the tug of the chains that links him to the hours? I look among my shelves and on my display tables and see that I am well provided for the buyer of anthologies. I know the contents, or some of the contents of them all. I have Palgrave's Golden Treasury, a Routledge edition, heroic and patriotic verses in the Everyman series, The Realm of Poetry, published by Harrop, a most interesting introduction to poetry, the 100 best lyrical poems, and also, for I am up to date, an anthology of modern verse, which Methuen published last year. I believe I have all those, or almost all those, on my shelf. With these, I am ready for any customer, if not to sell, at least to tell how good each book is. With these, I am ready for how good each book is. I confess I am a modern in poetry in spite of my first loves. If I were young again and I could choose my anthology for the 20s, my choice would be the Anthology of Modern Verse. It is modern, for the voice of the men who went to the war is over, but it is not a voice with a martial note. It is the voice of the fuller experience, the voice of men who saw life as greatly, that they beheld life greatly. It is an anthology of large horizons, and so I think I would make it mine. I were 20 tomorrow, if I were 20 tomorrow, and not an aging and amateurish seller of anthologies. I wish I might have a customer now. I wish it were a youth aged 20. I wish he would ask for an anthology. I wish that I might sell him one, and perhaps I could be making history. Then we go on to Poetry and a Pun. A special show of most of my stock of poetry this week has proved a failure. People will buy poetry when it suits them, apparently, and yet a great paper like The Observer prints the following today. I have read it twice, once aloud, and I don't make much of it. I will now transcribe it, for writing, says the learned Bacon, maketh an exact man. It is from the Apology for Poetry by Sir Philip Sidney, and yet it be noted that I haven't the book in stock. It is for my education's sake that I transcribe the quotation. and there's a long paragraph quotation. Since then, poetry of all human learning, the most ancient and the most fatherly antiquity, as from whence other learnings have taken their beginnings, since it is so universal that no learned nation doth despise it, nor no barbarian nation is without it, since both Roman and Greek are divine names unto it, the one of prophesizing, the other of making, and that indeed that name of making is fit for him, considering that whereas other arts remain themselves within their subject and receive, as it were, their beginning from it, the poet only bringeth his own stuff, and doth not learn a conceit out of a matter, but maketh matter for a conceit, since neither his description nor his end containeth an evil, the thing described cannot be evil, since his effects be so good as to touch goodness and to delight the learners, since therein, namely in the moral doctrine, the chief of the knowledge, a chief of all knowledge, he doth not only far past the historian, but for instructing well nigh comparable to the philosopher, and for moving leaves him behind him. Since the Holy Scriptures, wherein there is an uncleanliness, hath whole parts in it poetical, and even our Saviour Christ voucheth to use the flowers of it, since all his kinds are not only in their united forms, but in their several dissections fully commendable. I think rightly that laurel crowned appointed for triumphing captains doth worthy of all other learnings honor the poet's triumph. That's a long sentence and a bit meandering. Very clotted stuff, that. Oh. Okay, yes, it was. If poetry are all dull, there would be less sale for it even than there is. My studies go further, referring to Brewer, 2 volumes, Cassell. I add the following to my stores of knowledge. Poet is derived from Greek poio, to make. Poetical justice is that ideal justice which poets exercise in making the good happy and the bad unsuccessful in their schemes. And now what do I know of poetry? Nothing. And what is nothing? Brewer, the Reverend E. Cobham, LLD, to boot, Doctor of Divinity, helps me to the perfect answer by a poet too. Nothing, wrote Shakespeare, is a tune played by the picture of nobody. Thou art nothing, says another poet, thou shalt not be less. The poetical justice is done, and the eyes have it. And I am going to change my window tonight. I will put in biography, war books, recent purchase of the historian's history of the world in 25 volumes, and the 100 best essays by Earl Birkenhead. Before going to bed, I will put a prayer for a good sale, the bookseller, on his knees for his needs. Quote, a pun, said Dr. Johnson. Was it Dr. Johnson now? He who hath made a pun would pick your pocket. Happy augury. I will pick pockets tomorrow and give good books in exchange. Yeah, the historian's history of the world in 25 volumes. That's an interesting set. And 100 best essays by Earl Birkenhead is a good one as well. Yeah, so there ends this today's, and we'll continue on tomorrow. Thank you.